At 4:17 a.m. on August 20th, 2016, a man walked into a sleeping child's bedroom, wrapped her in her favorite pink frozen blanket, and carried her into the darkness. But the man who murdered 5-year-old Elena Herle wasn't a stranger breaking through a window. He wasn't some faceless predator lurking outside. He was her father's best friend. He was a co-worker who'd spent countless Friday nights playing softball with her dad. He'd been invited into their home multiple times. He knew the layout. He knew where Elena slept. And on the night of August 19th, 2016, after drinking beers and laughing at the local bar with her parents, he waited until the family fell asleep. Then he made a choice that would end a little girl's life and shatter an entire community. This is the story of how a town of 1,000 people learned that trust can be the most dangerous thing you give someone. I'm your host at Easy Case, and what I'm about to share with you goes beyond true crime. This is about betrayal at its deepest level. This is about a family that did everything right, lived in the safest place imaginable, and still lost everything. This is about a community that had already buried teenagers killed by a drunk driver, that had just survived a devastating tornado, and was about to face something even darker. And this is about the question that will haunt you long after this story ends. How do you know who to trust? Before we go any further, I need to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. This story happened in a town of just 1,000 people, but it could happen anywhere. Let me know where you're tuning in from. To understand the full weight of what happened on that August morning, you first need to understand Watkins, Minnesota. And I mean really understand it. Because this isn't just backdrop. This town, this community, is as much a part of this story as any person in it. Watkins is the kind of place that doesn't appear on most maps. With a population hovering around 1,000 residents, it's what locals call a stoplight-free town. There are no traffic lights here, no chain restaurants, no shopping malls, just Main Street, a few churches, a couple of bars, and generations of families who've known each other since before they could walk. It sits in Meeker County in central Minnesota, right along Highway 55 between the towns of Kimball and Eden Valley, about 70 miles northwest of Minneapolis, about 25 miles south of St. Cloud. It's farming country where the landscape rolls gently with cornfields and soybean crops stretching to the horizon. The kind of place where the pace of life moves slower than in the cities, where people still wave at passing cars even if they don't recognize the driver, where children ride their bikes without helmets and play outside until the streetlights come on. It's the kind of place people move to precisely because they want their children to grow up safe, surrounded by neighbors who care, surrounded by people they can trust. The heart of Watkins is St. Anthony Catholic Church, located at 171 Central Avenue. With approximately 250 families in its congregation, the church isn't just a place of worship, it's the social center of the community. It's where families celebrate baptisms and first communions, where they gather for funerals and festivals, where the entire town comes together in times of crisis. And by the summer of 2016, Watkins had certainly experienced its share of crisis. Just 1 year earlier, in August of 2015, the community had been devastated when 2 teenagers from Watkins were killed in a crash involving a drunk driver. One of those teens was Zachary Rohrbeck. Remember that name, because Zachary Rohrbeck was Elena Herle's cousin. The Herle family had already buried one child, already experienced the particular agony that comes from senseless, preventable tragedy, already stood in St. Anthony Catholic Church with tears streaming down their faces, asking God why. But they had no idea that the summer of 2016 would bring an even more immediate crisis. On July 11th, 2016, at approximately 5:55 inches the evening, the National Weather Service issued a warning that would send anyone who heard it running for cover. Large and extremely dangerous tornado. What hit Watkins that evening was classified as an EF2 tornado, a significant storm with maximum winds reaching 125 miles per hour. To put that in perspective, those are winds strong enough to tear the roof off a house, flip cars, turn everyday objects into deadly projectiles. The tornado carved a path 2 miles long and 600 feet wide, directly through the town. And when it finally lifted, when the roaring stopped and the debris settled, the devastation was extensive. 25 homes sustained damage, with 12 of them extensively damaged. 5 businesses were hit. The Hilltop Healthcare Center, an assisted living facility, suffered roof damage and had to evacuate 50 residents in the middle of the chaos. The mobile home park was damaged. One woman, Dolores Faber, was injured when she was pinned beneath a table and had to be hospitalized. Sheriff Brian Cruz of Meeker County would later say it was the worst storm damage the area had seen in 10 years. Luann Hess, who had lived in Watkins for 38 years, told reporters, "Never a bad storm like this, not this disruptive." But true to the character of small-town Minnesota, the Watkins community reacted immediately. Within days, a table had been set up inside City Hall filled with donated soaps, foodstuffs, and other goods for tornado victims. Neighbors helped neighbors repair roofs and clear debris. Volunteers showed up with chainsaws and work gloves. The town came together as it always did, because that's what you do in a place like Watkins. You take care of your own. And there's one more critical detail about that tornado that would become tragically significant just over 1 month later. The tornado's path took it directly down the same street where the Herle family lived. So, by mid-August of 2016, Watkins was a community still in recovery mode. Donation tables still sat in City Hall. Blue tarps still covered damaged roofs. The sound of hammers and saws still echoed through neighborhoods as repairs continued. People were tired. They were emotionally drained. They'd lost 2 teenagers to a drunk driver. They'd watched a tornado rip through their town. And they were doing what communities like this do. They were rebuilding. They were healing. They were moving forward together. It was against this backdrop, a small town that had already endured a fatal crash and a devastating natural disaster in just over a year, that an even darker tragedy was about to unfold. If you've ever lived in a small town like this, you know what I'm talking about. Drop a comment and tell me, what time is it where you are right now? Elena Herle was born on October 31st, 2010, in Street Cloud, Minnesota, Halloween. From the very beginning, her family called her their little peanut, and by all accounts, she was exactly the kind of child who lights up every room she enters. At 5 years old, Elena had sandy blonde, shoulder-length hair and big brown eyes that seemed to always be smiling. She weighed about 45 pounds, all energy and joy and innocence. She possessed the kind of infectious happiness that adults find both delightful and humbling, the kind that makes you remember what it was like before the world got complicated. Her mother, Kayla Herle, would later describe her daughter's morning routine, and I want you to really hear this. She would come in our room every morning and give us a kiss, good morning, and make sure everybody else was okay. Think about that for a moment. A 5-year-old child concerned about making sure everyone else was okay, not demanding breakfast, not complaining about being tired, but checking on her parents, making sure they were all right. That tells you everything you need to know about who Elena was. Nicole Rohrbeck, a close family friend, put it simply, "I've never seen her unhappy." Elena's obituary would later note that she gave joy to our lives by always having a smile and kind words to say. She was an animal lover, a princess, a singer, a great friend to everyone she met. Like most little girls her age, Elena had specific interests and favorites. She loved My Little Ponies. She adored wearing skirts and jewelry, the kind of sparkly, colorful things that make little girls feel like royalty. Her favorite colors were pink and purple. Her favorite movie was Disney's Frozen, and she was particularly fond of Princess Elsa, so much so that she had a pink Elsa blanket that she slept with every single night. That blanket was her comfort, her security, the thing she reached for when she was tired or scared or just wanted to feel safe. Her favorite song was "You Are My Sunshine," which her family called her song. This detail, this simple, beautiful detail, would take on heartbreaking significance at her funeral. But Elena wasn't just a princess-loving little girl. She was also adventurous and outdoorsy. She loved going hunting with her father, Matt Herle. She played on go-karts that her dad had built for her and her older brother, Carter. She swung hula hoops and rode bicycles with the freedom and fearlessness that comes naturally to children growing up in a safe small town. The kind of town where parents don't worry when their kids are out of sight for a few minutes. The kind of town where danger is supposed to be something that happens somewhere else. Her relationship with her brother, Carter, who was approximately 8 years old at the time, was particularly special. The obituary noted that she loved learning from her brother and always gave the best hugs. Anyone who has siblings knows that bond, that mixture of admiration and annoyance and unconditional love that only brothers and sisters share. Elena had just completed preschool at Eden Valley Watkins Elementary School, where her mother, Kayla, both worked and volunteered. Her teacher for the upcoming kindergarten year had already been assigned, Dawn Kwakela. The new school year was set to begin just 2 weeks after August 20th, 2016. Dawn Kwakela would never get to teach Elena. The Herle family was deeply rooted in the Watkins community. Elena's paternal grandparents, Rick and Kim Herle, owned the Riverside Tavern in nearby Litchfield. Her maternal grandparents were Jeff and Mary Weller of Rockville. She had aunts, uncles, and cousins throughout the region. The family were active parishioners at St. Anthony Catholic Church, attending services regularly and participating in community events. They were woven into the fabric of this town. In her short 5 years of life, Elena had already experienced loss. Her obituary notes that she was preceded in death by several great-grandparents and most significantly by 2 cousins, Zyla Roberts and Zachary Rohrbeck. That second name, Zachary Rohrbeck, was the teenager killed in the drunk driving crash just 1 year earlier. So the Herle family knew grief. They understood tragedy. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared them for what was about to happen. Reverend Aaron Nett of St. Anthony Catholic Church would later say at Elena's funeral, "Today we remember a little girl who was given to us as a gift. She had a love for others which was free and innocent." Free and innocent. That's exactly what 5-year-old children should be. That's exactly what Elena was until the early morning hours of August 20th, 2016. Friday, August 19th, 2016, was supposed to be just another typical Friday night for Matt Herle and his friend Zachary Anderson. Every Friday during the summer, Matt played on a local softball team called the River Rats. It was a recreational league, the kind of thing working men do to unwind after a week of labor, to maintain friendships, to feel young and competitive even as they inch toward middle age. Matt worked as a utility locator for a company called Vanguard Utility Partners, a job that involved finding and marking underground utility lines before construction or excavation work began. It was outdoor work, physical work, the kind that makes a cold beer taste particularly good on a Friday night. Zachary Anderson worked for the same company, though on a different crew. He and Matt had been co-workers for years, had become friends through work, and Anderson had become a regular fixture at Friday night softball games. Just one of the guys, someone Matt trusted, someone Matt considered a friend. At approximately 10:30 that evening, Matt and Zachary were at the softball field together playing with their team. It was a typical August evening in Minnesota, warm but not oppressive, with the sun setting late and the air filled with the sounds of aluminum bats connecting with softballs and friendly trash talk between teammates. After the game ended around 11, the group decided to continue the night at Riverside Tavern in Forest City. Anderson and Matt Herle arrived at the bar somewhere between 11 and 1:00 inches the morning. Anderson consumed 2 beers. The conversation turned, as it often did among Minnesota men, to hunting. Anderson mentioned his family's cabin up north, the kind of place Minnesota men dream about. A rustic retreat in the woods where you can hunt deer and fish and escape the pressures of daily life. Matt would have had no reason to think twice about this conversation. Anderson had mentioned the cabin before. It was just casual bar talk, just 2 friends discussing the upcoming hunting season over beers. Around 1:30 to 2:00 inches the morning, the group moved to a second location, Gordy's Bar in Watkins, located on Central Avenue, just blocks from the Herle family home. This was even more convenient, even more casual. Matt's wife, Kayla, joined them at Gordy's. Anderson bought beers for the Herles. He consumed several vodka Red Bulls himself. Everyone was relaxed, laughing, enjoying the end of another work week. The bar closed at 2:00 inches the morning, as Minnesota law requires. Kayla headed home first, arriving around 2:00. She went upstairs and put 5-year-old Elena to bed, making sure she had her beloved pink Princess Elsa blanket tucked around her. This would be the last time anyone except Zachary Anderson would see Elena Herle alive. Matt arrived home around 2:30 inches the morning, and sometime between 3:30 and 3:45 inches the morning, Zachary Anderson arrived at the residence. Now, this is important. This is the detail that makes this entire story so terrifying. Anderson showing up at the home after a night of drinking was not unusual. Sheriff Brian Cruz would later emphasize this point to reporters. Our suspect in this case is a family friend, co-worker of the victim's father, and was staying the night up in Watkins last night. He had previously been to that residence and spent a night here and there, so he's not a stranger and not new to the residence. The phrase "spent a night here and there" is crucial. Anderson wasn't a stranger. He wasn't some predator lurking outside the house looking for an opportunity. He was a trusted friend who had been welcomed into the Herle home multiple times. He knew the layout. He knew where the bedrooms were. He knew where Elena slept. He knew the family's routines. He knew that Matt and Kayla trusted him completely. According to what investigators would later piece together, Matt Herle and Anderson talked for a while after Anderson arrived, probably until around 4:00 the morning. Just two friends, tired and buzzed, winding down the night. Then Matt, exhausted from work and drinking and softball, went to bed. He left Zachary Anderson awake in his home, where his 5-year-old daughter was sleeping. Real quick, if you're finding this story as intense as I am, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We cover cases like this every week, and your support helps us keep telling these stories. Also, drop a comment. What's the weather like where you are today? I'm curious who's watching. Somewhere between 4 and 8 that Saturday morning, August 20th, 2016, Zachary Todd Anderson entered Elena Herle's bedroom. He wrapped her in her pink, frozen blanket, the one she loved, the one that made her feel safe, and he carried her out of the house. He also took the keys to Matt's 2002 GMC Sierra pickup truck, and critically, Matt's cell phone was inside that truck. When Matt and Kayla woke up between 8 and 8:30 that morning, their daughter was gone. Anderson was gone. Matt's truck was gone, and an 8-hour nightmare was about to begin. Imagine waking up in your home, the home you've lived in for years, in the town where you grew up, surrounded by neighbors you've known your entire life, and discovering that your 5-year-old daughter is simply gone. Not gone from her bed having wandered into another room, not playing hide and seek, not at a friend's house. Just gone. And the man you trusted, the man you considered a friend, the man you'd been drinking with just hours earlier, is also gone, along with your truck. This was the reality Matt and Kayla Herle woke up to at approximately 8 to 8:30 on Saturday morning, August 20th, 2016. The initial moments of a parental nightmare are always the same. Confusion giving way to concern, giving way to panic, giving way to sheer terror. You check every room, calling out her name. Elena. Elena, honey, where are you? You run outside, looking up and down the street. You call the cell phone, hoping for a reasonable explanation, some silly misunderstanding. Matt's cell phone went straight to voicemail, because it was in his truck, and his truck was at that very moment approximately 80 to 100 miles away, heading north through rural Minnesota with his daughter inside. By 10 that morning, Matt and Kayla had contacted the Meeker County Sheriff's Office to file a missing persons report. The initial response would have been standard procedure: get descriptions, get the last known information, start making calls. But this wasn't a typical missing person case, and law enforcement knew it immediately. A 5-year-old girl doesn't just wander away. A family friend doesn't just drive off with someone's child without permission. And most critically, there was that cell phone. This is where modern technology becomes both a blessing and a curse in criminal investigations. Matt's cell phone was in the stolen truck, and cell phones constantly communicate with cell towers, leaving a digital trail of their location. By tracking the phone, investigators could track the truck, and by tracking the truck, they could track Zachary Anderson and Elena. At 6:30 that morning, remember, this is before the Herles had even woken up to discover them missing, the cell phone had pinged off a tower in Todd County, which is north of Meeker County, along the route towards central Minnesota's lake, country, and wilderness areas. At 8:30 the morning, a critically important sighting occurred. Anderson was spotted alone at a convenience store near Browerville, Minnesota. Browerville is a tiny town in Todd County with a population of only about 740 people. It's the kind of place with one gas station, one convenience store, the kind of place where a stranger sticks out. Anderson appeared alone at the store. There was no mention of seeing Elena. This sighting confirmed he was traveling north, confirmed he had the truck, confirmed the timeline. But it also raised a horrifying question. Where was Elena at 8:30 inches the morning? At 9 that morning, the cell phone pinged one final time in Todd County, and then it was shut off. This is a critically important detail. Anderson knew the phone could be tracked, so he turned it off. This wasn't panic. This wasn't confusion. This was conscious decision-making. This was someone who understood they were being hunted and took steps to avoid capture. By 10, when Matt and Kayla filed their missing persons report, Anderson and Elena had already been gone for potentially 6 hours, and the trail had just gone cold. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the state's primary investigative agency for major crimes, joined the investigation immediately. This wasn't going to be handled just by small-town sheriffs. This required resources, expertise, and coordination across multiple counties. And then at 1:12 inches the afternoon, the decision was made that would turn this from a local emergency into a statewide crisis. A statewide Amber Alert was issued for 5-year-old Elena Herle and 25-year-old suspect Zachary Todd Anderson. Suddenly, this wasn't just Watkins's tragedy. This wasn't just Meeker County's problem. Every Minnesotan with a cell phone, every person watching television, every driver on every highway would now see Elena's face and Anderson's description. The alert described Elena as a white female child, 5 years old, 3 feet 6 inches tall, 45 pounds, with brown eyes and blonde shoulder-length hair. She was believed to be wearing a pink nightgown. The alert noted she had been abducted by a family acquaintance. Anderson was described as a white male, 5 feet 10 inches tall, approximately 200 pounds, with dark hair and a shaggy beard. The vehicle was described as a 2002 gray GMC Sierra with Minnesota license plates. The alert included one more crucial detail. Anderson was believed to be in the Alexandria area. This made sense, given the Todd County cell phone pings and the northward trajectory. Alexandria is a popular resort town in central Minnesota, known for its lakes and summer cabins. But investigators had one more critical piece of information that wouldn't be made public for several more hours, and this information would change everything. At approximately 2 that afternoon, as the Amber Alert spread across Minnesota and hundreds of law enforcement officers scrambled to find any trace of Anderson and Elena, a phone rang at the Cass County Sheriff's Office. The caller was Zachary Anderson's father. Think about this for a moment. Put yourself in this man's position. You've seen the Amber Alert. You've seen your son's name. You've seen the face of a 5-year-old girl. You know your son has access to a cabin, your family's cabin, in a remote area of Cass County. You know he's mentioned it before. You know he knows how to get there. And now you have to make a choice. You can say nothing, protect your son, hope he gets away, hope this is all some terrible misunderstanding. Or you can do what Anderson's father did. You can immediately call law enforcement and give them permission to search the property. We don't know this man's name. It's never been made public. But his actions that day may well have been the key to solving this case. Because while hundreds of officers were searching the Alexandria area, while helicopters scanned lakes and roads, while K-9 units combed through forests, Anderson wasn't in Alexandria at all. He was at that cabin in Cass County. And now law enforcement knew exactly where to look. So here's what I want you to think about. Here's the question that should be sitting heavy in your chest right now. At this moment in the story, Elena had been missing for over 12 hours. Anderson had turned off the cell phone. He was in a remote cabin in the woods, and law enforcement was racing against time. What do you think they found when they got there? And more importantly, how do you ever trust anyone again after something like this? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what's going through your mind right now, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because this story is far from over, and what happens next will change this community forever. The cabin sat deep in the woods of Cass County, miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by dense forest and the kind of silence that makes every sound feel amplified. This wasn't some weekend getaway spot with manicured lawns and a dock. This was isolation. This was the kind of place where you go when you don't want to be found. And that's exactly why Zachary Anderson went there. By 3 that afternoon, law enforcement had the location. Anderson's father had given them permission to search the property, had told them exactly where it was, had made the choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But knowing where Anderson was and getting to him were two very different things. Cass County is in north-central Minnesota, over 100 miles from Watkins. The cabin was remote, accessible only by rough roads that wound through thick woods, and every minute that ticked by was another minute that Elena might still be alive. Might be. That word hung in the air like smoke, because by this point, over 13 hours had passed since Elena was taken from her bed. 13 hours since anyone had seen her except the man who'd carried her out, wrapped in her pink blanket. 13 hours in which anything could have happened. Multiple law enforcement agencies converged on that location. Cass County Sheriff's deputies, Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension agents, tactical units, trained for exactly this kind of situation. They approached with extreme caution because they had no idea what they were walking into. Was Anderson armed? Was he barricaded inside? Was Elena still alive? Was she injured? Was she even there? The gray GMC Sierra pickup truck was parked outside the cabin. Matt Herle's truck. The truck Anderson had stolen along with his daughter. That confirmed they had the right location. But it didn't answer the question that was tearing through every officer's mind. Where was Elena? Officers surrounded the cabin, weapons drawn, every sense heightened. The woods were quiet except for the sound of boots on dirt and leaves, the crackle of radio communications, the pounding of hearts that knew they were about to discover something that would stay with them forever. Zachary Todd Anderson was taken into custody without incident. He didn't resist, didn't fight, didn't try to run. He simply surrendered, as if he'd been expecting them, as if he knew this moment was inevitable. But Elena wasn't with him. Think about what that means. Think about what went through the minds of those officers when they secured Anderson and realized that little girl wasn't in the cabin. After everything, after the Amber Alert and the statewide search and the father's phone call and the race against time, she wasn't there. So where was she? Anderson wasn't talking. Not at first. He sat in the back of a patrol car, silent, his face unreadable. The man who'd played softball and drank beers and laughed with Matt Herle just hours earlier was gone. What remained was something else entirely, something cold, something that had made a choice in the early morning hours that couldn't be undone. Officers began searching the area around the cabin. K-9 units were deployed, dogs trained to track human scent, to find people dead or alive. The terrain was difficult, dense with underbrush and trees, the kind of wilderness where you could hide something, or someone, and it might never be found. The dogs picked up a trail leading away from the cabin, deeper into the woods, and that's when investigators knew. That's when the hope that had been barely flickering, barely alive, finally died. Because if Elena had been alive, if she'd been able to walk, those dogs would have found her near the cabin. The fact that the trail led away, that it went deeper into the forest, meant someone had carried something into those woods. Officers followed the trail, their boots crunching through undergrowth, branches scraping against tactical gear, radios silent now because there was nothing left to say. They knew what they were going to find. They just didn't know how bad it was going to be. And then they found her. In a wooded area approximately 100 yards from the cabin, wrapped in her pink frozen blanket, the blanket that was supposed to keep her safe, the blanket she'd slept with every night of her short life, lay 5-year-old Elena Herle. She was gone. The little girl who kissed her parents good morning every day. The little girl who made sure everyone else was okay. The little girl who loved My Little Ponies and wearing skirts and going hunting with her dad. The little girl who was supposed to start kindergarten in 2 weeks. The little girl who'd never seen her unhappy. She was gone. I want you to pause here for a second. I want you to think about those officers, hardened professionals who'd seen terrible things in their careers, standing in those woods looking at a 5-year-old child who'd been murdered by someone her family trusted. Think about the phone call they had to make. Think about Matt and Kayla Herle, who'd spent the entire day in agony, hoping against hope that their daughter would be found alive, waiting for news, praying for a miracle. Think about the moment they were told there would be no miracle. The Meeker County Sheriff's Office held a press conference that evening. Sheriff Brian Cruz stood before cameras and reporters and a community that was holding its breath, and he delivered the news that everyone had been dreading. We have located the body of Elena Herle. A suspect is in custody. Those words, clinical and necessary and absolutely devastating, spread through Watkins like wildfire. Within minutes, everyone knew. The donation tables at City Hall, where people had been dropping off supplies for tornado victims, became gathering places for grief. Street Anthony Catholic Church opened its doors. People who'd already cried too many tears over the past year found themselves crying again. But here's what you need to understand. Finding Elena's body was only the beginning. Now came the questions, the investigation, the need to understand not just what happened, but why, and most terrifyingly, whether this was the first time Zachary Anderson had done something like this. I want to pause here for a second. If this case is affecting you, and I know it is, take a moment and leave a comment. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me how you're feeling. This community came together in ways that will break your heart and inspire you. Stick with me. The autopsy was conducted by the Ramsey County Medical Examiner's Office, and what they discovered would be presented as evidence in a courtroom, would be read aloud to a jury, would become part of the permanent record of what Zachary Anderson did to Elena Herle in the hours after he carried her out of her home. The cause of death was asphyxiation. Elena had been smothered. The manner of death was homicide. There was evidence of sexual assault. Let me say that again because I need you to understand the full scope of what happened. This wasn't a kidnapping gone wrong. This wasn't a panicked mistake. This wasn't an accident. Zachary Anderson sexually assaulted and murdered a 5-year-old child. A child whose father considered him a friend. A child who had no reason to be afraid of him because he'd been in her home before. A child who probably didn't even wake up fully before he wrapped her in her blanket and carried her away. The timeline that investigators pieced together was damning. Anderson had left the Herle home sometime around 4 a.m. with Elena. The cell phone pings showed he'd been traveling north by 6:30 a.m. He'd been spotted alone at the convenience store in Browerville at 8:30 a.m., which meant that by 8:30 that morning, while Matt and Kayla were just waking up and discovering their daughter was missing, Elena was likely already dead. He'd had 4.5 hours alone with her, 4.5 hours to drive to that remote cabin, 4.5 hours to do what he did, 4.5 hours that would haunt everyone who loved Elena for the rest of their lives. But the evidence collected at the scene and during the autopsy told investigators something else, something that made this case even more disturbing. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't a crime of opportunity that spiraled out of control. Anderson had taken Matt's truck keys. He'd taken the cell phone. He'd known about the cabin, had mentioned it casually at the bar just hours earlier. He'd turned off the cell phone at 9 a.m. because he knew it could be tracked. Every single action showed planning, showed awareness, showed that Zachary Anderson knew exactly what he was doing. And that raised the most terrifying question of all. If he'd done this before, if he'd thought about it, planned it, fantasized about it, were there other victims? Were there other families who trusted him? Were there other children? Investigators immediately began digging into Anderson's background, and what they found painted a picture of a man who'd been hiding in plain sight for years. On the surface, he was exactly what he appeared to be: a 25-year-old utility locator, a softball player, a guy who drank beers at local bars and talked about hunting, someone you'd never suspect. But beneath that surface was something else entirely. Anderson had a history with law enforcement, though nothing that had resulted in serious charges. There had been complaints, incidents, moments where people had felt uncomfortable but hadn't been able to articulate exactly why, the kind of red flags that are only obvious in hindsight after something terrible has already happened. Investigators obtained warrants to search Anderson's electronic devices, his phone, his computer, his social media accounts, and what they found confirmed their worst fears. There was evidence of a sexual interest in children, search histories that showed he'd been looking at illegal content, communications that suggested he'd been thinking about this for a long time. How long had Zachary Anderson been a predator? How many times had he been around children, been trusted by families, been welcomed into homes, all while hiding what he really was? How many close calls had there been? How many times had he thought about it but stopped himself? And what made August 20th, 2016 the night he finally acted? Because here's what we haven't talked about yet. Here's the part of the story that extends beyond the courtroom and the prison sentence, and even beyond the immediate grief. It's the part about what happens next. What happens to a family after they've buried their child and faced their child's killer in court and watched him be led away in shackles? What happens to a community after it's been shattered by betrayal? What happens to all of us who hear these stories and have to figure out how to process them, how to learn from them, how to move forward without becoming paralyzed by fear. The Herle family had to figure out how to be a family of 3 when they'd been a family of 4. They had to navigate Carter's grief while dealing with their own. They had to figure out how to answer when people asked, "How many children do you have?" Do you say 1 and erase Elena from existence? Do you say 2 and then have to explain what happened? Do you say, "I have 1 living child," and watch the person's face change as they realize what that means? These are the impossible questions that parents who've lost children have to answer every single day for the rest of their lives. They had to go back to work eventually, back to the routines of daily life, back to a world that had moved on even though theirs had stopped. They had to drive past the softball field where Matt and Anderson used to play, past Gordy's bar where they'd had drinks that final night, past the street where their house stood, the house where Elena had been taken from her bed. Every single place in Watkins held a memory. Every single familiar face was a reminder. The town that had once felt like the safest place in the world now felt haunted. And Carter, 8 years old when his sister was murdered, had to grow up in the shadow of that tragedy. He had to go back to school where everyone knew what had happened. He had to deal with the stares and the whispers and the kids who didn't know what to say, so they said nothing at all. He had to sleep in a house where his sister's bedroom sat empty. He had to live with the knowledge that someone his family trusted had done something so terrible that adults couldn't even fully explain it to him. The impact of Elena's murder on Carter is something we can't fully measure. How do you quantify the loss of a sibling? How do you measure the trauma of having your sense of safety destroyed at 8 years old? How do you calculate the ways that tragedy shapes the person you become? Research shows that children who lose siblings, especially to violence, often struggle with survivor's guilt, anxiety, depression, and difficulty forming trusting relationships. They grow up faster than they should. They lose the innocence of childhood in a way that can never be restored. They carry the weight of their family's grief even as they're trying to process their own. Carter lost his sister, his playmate, the person who gave the best hugs. But he also lost the childhood he should have had. The carefree existence where the worst thing that could happen was a scraped knee or a bad grade. He learned far too young that the world is dangerous, that people can't always be trusted, that terrible things happen even in small towns where everyone knows everyone. And Matt and Kayla had to parent him through that while dealing with their own trauma. They had to be strong for him when they were barely holding themselves together. They had to answer his questions when they didn't have answers for their own. They had to help him feel safe when they no longer felt safe themselves. This is the ripple effect of violence. It doesn't just destroy the immediate victim, it radiates outward, touching everyone in concentric circles. The family, the extended family, the friends, the community. And even those of us hearing the story years later, trying to make sense of how something like this could happen. The community of Watkins had its own healing to do. The tornado had been a natural disaster, terrible but impersonal. The drunk driving crash had been a tragedy, but it fit into a category people understood. But Elena's murder was different. It was personal. It was a betrayal. It was one of their own turning out to be a monster. Parents in Watkins had to have conversations with their children that they'd never imagined having, about body safety, about the difference between good secrets and bad secrets, about how sometimes people who seem nice aren't actually safe, about how it's okay to say no to adults, even adults, you know, if something feels wrong. These are conversations that steal innocence, conversations that plant seeds of fear and suspicion, conversations that are absolutely necessary but come at a cost. The softball league continued, but it was never quite the same. The Friday night games at the bar continued, but there was always an empty space where Anderson used to sit. The community events at Street Anthony Catholic Church continued, but there was always a little girl missing from the children's section. Watkins learned to live with the scar, because that's what you do. You don't get over something like this. You don't move past it. You learn to carry it. You learn to function despite the weight. You learn that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means finding a way to keep going, even though the wound never fully closes. And here's something else we need to talk about. Something that makes people uncomfortable but needs to be said. Zachary Anderson didn't become a predator overnight. He didn't wake up on August 19, 2016, and suddenly decide to harm a child. The evidence found on his devices, the pattern of behavior investigators uncovered, All of it pointed to someone who'd been moving in this direction for a long time, which means there were probably warning signs, moments when something felt off but people dismissed it, comments that seemed strange but not strange enough to report, behaviors that raised eyebrows but not alarms. This isn't about blaming anyone. The only person responsible for what happened to Elena is Zachary Anderson, but it is about understanding how predators operate. They test boundaries. They groom not just their victims but entire communities. They build trust and credibility so that when someone does feel uncomfortable, they second-guess themselves. They think, but he's such a nice guy, or I'm probably overreacting, or I don't want to cause problems. Predators count on that hesitation. They count on people being more afraid of social awkwardness than of speaking up. They count on the benefit of the doubt. And that's why education matters. That's why conversations about this stuff, uncomfortable as they are so important. Because the more people understand how predators operate, the harder it becomes for them to hide. There are organizations now that work specifically on this issue, groups that teach parents and educators and community members how to recognize grooming behaviors, how to create environments where children feel safe reporting abuse, how to respond when a child does come forward, how to balance trust with appropriate vigilance. Some of these organizations were created by families like the Herles, families who lost children and decided that the only way to survive their grief was to turn it into action, to make sure their child's death meant something, to prevent other families from experiencing the same nightmare. I don't know if the Herle family has done this. Their privacy deserves to be respected, and not every family who experiences tragedy wants to become a public advocate. Some people heal by speaking out, others heal by stepping back, by protecting what's left of their privacy, by focusing on their surviving children and their own recovery. Both approaches are valid, both are necessary. There's no right way to grieve. There's no correct response to having your child murdered by someone you trusted. But what I do know is that Elena's story has become part of the larger conversation about child safety. It's been covered in true crime podcasts and news articles and case studies. It's been used as an example in training sessions for law enforcement and social workers. It's been discussed in parenting forums and community meetings. And every time her story is told, every time someone hears what happened and decides to have that uncomfortable conversation with their kids, or to trust their instincts about someone who seems off, or to take a child's disclosure seriously instead of dismissing it, Elena's death means something beyond the tragedy itself. That doesn't make it okay. It doesn't balance the scales. It doesn't solve the equation of grief plus justice. But it does mean that her short life continues to have impact, that she's remembered not just as a victim but as a catalyst for change. Let's talk about Zachary Anderson for a moment. Not to humanize him or excuse what he did, but to understand it. Because understanding how someone becomes capable of something like this is part of preventing it from happening again. Anderson is serving his life sentence in a Minnesota state prison. He's in a unit with other offenders who've committed crimes against children, separated from the general population for his own safety. Because even in prison, even among people who've committed serious crimes, there's a hierarchy, and people who hurt children are at the bottom. He'll spend the rest of his life in a cell. He'll eat prison food and follow prison routines and have virtually no freedom or autonomy. He'll never play softball again, never drink a beer at a bar, never go hunting at that cabin, never have a family or a career or any of the things that make life worth living. Some people would say that's not punishment enough, that someone who did what he did deserves worse, that life in prison is too easy, too comfortable, too merciful. Others would say that decades in a cage, knowing you'll die there, knowing you'll never experience freedom again, is its own kind of death. A slow, grinding punishment that lasts far longer than any execution. I'm not here to tell you which perspective is right. That's something everyone has to decide for themselves, based on their own values and beliefs about justice and punishment and redemption. What I will say is this. Anderson made a choice. He chose to betray trust. He chose to harm an innocent child. He chose to prioritize his own desires over Elena's life. And now he's living with the consequences of that choice. He'll have decades to think about what he did, to replay that night over and over, to imagine what his life could have been if he'd made different choices, to live with the knowledge that he's despised by everyone who knows his name, whether that constitutes justice, whether it provides any comfort to the Herle family, whether it serves any purpose beyond removing a dangerous person from society. Those are questions without easy answers. But here's what I keep coming back to. Here's the thought that won't leave me alone as I've researched this case and written this script and tried to make sense of something that defies sense. Elena Herle was 5 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. She could have been anything, done anything, become anyone. She could have been a teacher like the one who never got to teach her. She could have been a veterinarian, given her love of animals. She could have been an artist or an athlete or a scientist or a mother herself someday. All of that potential, all of those possibilities, all of that future was stolen in a few hours by someone who decided his desires mattered more than her life. And that's the real tragedy. Not just what happened, but everything that will never happen. Every birthday Elena won't celebrate. Every milestone she won't reach. Every person she won't meet and impact and love. The Herle family doesn't just grieve who Elena was, they grieve who she would have become. They grieve the daughter who won't graduate high school, the sister who won't be at Carter's wedding, the granddaughter who won't give her grandparents great-grandchildren, the friend who won't be there for life's big moments. They grieve a ghost, a future that was stolen before it could exist. And there's no sentence long enough, no punishment severe enough to compensate for that loss. So where does that leave us? What are we supposed to do with this story? How are we supposed to process it and learn from it and move forward? I think it starts with remembering that Elena was a real person, not a statistic, not a case number, not a plot point in a true crime story. She was a little girl who loved pink and purple and Princess Elsa, who gave the best hugs, who made sure everyone was okay. She mattered, her life mattered, and the fact that it was cut short doesn't diminish that. If anything, it makes it more important that we remember her, that we honor her, that we make sure her story is told in a way that respects who she was. I think it continues with education, with having those uncomfortable conversations about body safety and appropriate boundaries and how to recognize when something feels wrong, with teaching children that they have the right to say no, even to adults they know, with creating environments where disclosure is met with belief and support rather than skepticism and blame. I think it includes vigilance, not paranoia, but awareness, paying attention to the adults in our children's lives, asking questions, trusting our instincts, understanding that predators don't look like monsters, they look like everyone else, and that's exactly what makes them dangerous. And I think it requires community, supporting families who've experienced tragedy, showing up even when it's uncomfortable, continuing to care even after the news cameras leave and the headlines fade, understanding that grief doesn't have a timeline and healing isn't linear. The people of Watkins did this for the Herle family. They showed up at the funeral. They provided meals and support. They created space for grief while also helping the family find moments of normalcy. They didn't forget. They didn't move on. They carried the weight together. That's what community means. Not just celebrating together in good times, but bearing witness to each other's pain in the worst times. Not having all the answers, but showing up anyway. Now I want to hear from you, and I'm serious about this. I don't want you to just watch this video and move on to the next one. I want you to engage. I want you to think. I want you to take action. Here's what I'm asking. In the comments right now, I want you to answer this question. What is one specific thing you're going to do differently after hearing Elena's story? Not something vague like, be more careful. I want specifics. Are you going to have a conversation with your kids about body safety this week? Are you going to research the background check policies at your child's school or daycare? Are you going to trust your gut the next time something feels off about someone, even if you can't articulate why? Are you going to volunteer with an organization that works on child safety issues? Tell me, write it down, make it real, because that's how we turn this tragedy into something that matters beyond the immediate horror. That's how we honor Elena's memory. That's how we make sure that her story saves other children. And here's the second thing I want you to do. I want you to share this video. I know it's heavy. I know it's not the kind of content people usually share. But that's exactly why it's important. Send it to a parent. Send it to a teacher. Send it to anyone who works with children or has children in their lives. Because the more people who understand how predators operate, the more people who know Elena's story, the harder it becomes for people like Zachary Anderson to hide. And finally, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. We tell these stories every single week, not because we're entertained by violence, but because we believe the victims deserve to be remembered, because we believe their stories can teach us something, because we believe that awareness and education and community are the best weapons we have against the kind of evil that took Elena's life. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, be part of a community that believes these stories matter. Elena Herle should be alive today. She should be 13 years old, in 8th grade, dealing with homework and friends and figuring out who she wants to be. She should have her whole life ahead of her. Instead, she's frozen forever at 5 years old, forever in our memories as the little girl in the pink and purple who gave the best hugs. We can't change what happened to her, but we can make sure she's remembered. We can make sure her story is told. And we can make sure that we learn from this tragedy so that other families are spared this nightmare. So leave that comment, share this video, subscribe to the channel, and most importantly, take action. Have that conversation. Trust that instinct. Create that safer environment. Do something that makes a difference. Because that's how we honor Elena. That's how we turn grief into purpose. That's how we make sure that her short life continues to have meaning and impact long after she's gone. I'm your host at Cold Cases. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to Elena's story with the respect and attention it deserves. Thank you for being part of a community that cares. Elena Herle, October 31st, 2010 to August 20th, 2016. A little girl who loved freely and innocently. A little girl who made sure everyone was okay. A little girl who deserved so much better than what happened to her. She will never be forgotten. Now go. Leave that comment. Tell me what action you're going to take. I'll be reading every single one, and I'll be holding you accountable. Let's make sure Elena's story matters. Let's make sure it changes something. Let's make sure it saves lives. I'll see you in the next case. Until then, stay safe, stay aware, and never stop fighting to protect the innocent. These are questions that would be explored in court. Questions that prosecutors would use to build their case. Questions that the Herle family would demand answers to. But some questions don't have satisfying answers. Some questions just lead to more darkness. What we know for certain is this. Zachary Anderson had been a co-worker of Matt Herle's for years. He'd been to the Herle home multiple times. He'd spent the night there before. He knew the family's routines. He knew where Elena slept. And on the night of August 19th, after drinking and playing softball and laughing with the very people he was about to destroy, he made a choice. He chose to betray that trust in the most horrific way imaginable. The community of Watkins was reeling. This wasn't just grief. This was a fundamental shattering of everything they believed about their town, about their neighbors, about safety itself. In a place where everyone knows everyone, where people don't lock their doors, where children play outside unsupervised, the idea that a predator could be hiding among them was almost incomprehensible. Parents looked at their children's friends' parents differently. Softball teams disbanded. The Friday night games at the local bar felt different, tainted by the knowledge of what had happened after one of those nights. Trust, the very foundation of small-town life, had been poisoned, and the Herle family, already devastated by the loss of their daughter, had to grapple with an additional layer of trauma. The guilt, the what-ifs. What if Matt hadn't invited Anderson over? What if they'd locked the bedroom doors? What if they'd never become friends with him in the first place? What if they'd seen some sign, some indication of what he was capable of? These are the questions that torture parents after something like this. The rational part of your brain knows you couldn't have known, couldn't have predicted it, couldn't have stopped it. But the parent part of your brain, the part that's supposed to protect your child from everything, can't accept that, can't forgive itself, can't move past the fact that you let a monster into your home and he took your daughter. Zachary Todd Anderson was formally charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and criminal sexual conduct. In Minnesota, first-degree murder carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. There is no death penalty in Minnesota. The harshest punishment the state could impose was ensuring Anderson would never walk free again. He was held without bail at the Meeker County Jail, then transferred to a more secure facility as the case moved forward. His initial court appearances were brief, procedural. He appeared via video link, wearing an orange jumpsuit, his face blank. He said almost nothing. His attorney entered not guilty pleas on his behalf, which is standard procedure even when the evidence is overwhelming. But everyone knew where this was heading. The physical evidence was damning. The timeline was clear. Anderson's own actions, turning off the cell phone, driving to the remote cabin, had shown consciousness of guilt. And, most significantly, he'd eventually led investigators to Elena's body, which suggested he'd confessed, at least partially, to what he'd done. The prosecution's case was strong, overwhelming even. They had forensic evidence from the autopsy. They had the cell phone tracking data. They had the witness who'd seen Anderson alone at the convenience store. They had Anderson's father's testimony about the cabin. They had the digital evidence from Anderson's devices. And they had Anderson's own statements to law enforcement. But what could the defense possibly say? How do you defend someone who sexually assaulted and murdered a 5-year-old child? How do you stand in front of a jury and ask for anything other than the maximum sentence? The answer, in cases like this, is that you can't. Not really. The defense's job becomes damage control, ensuring the defendant's constitutional rights are protected, making sure the trial is fair and the evidence is properly presented. But there's no defense for what Anderson did. There's no explanation that makes it understandable. There's no mitigating factor that makes it less monstrous. Some crimes are simply indefensible. As the legal process moved forward, as prosecutors built their case and defense attorneys went through the motions, the community of Watkins prepared to say goodbye to Elena. And that goodbye would be one of the most heartbreaking moments in the town's history. But before we get there, I want you to think about something. I want you to think about the person sitting next to you right now, or the friend you saw last week, or the co-worker you chat with every day. How well do you really know them? How much of what they show you is real, and how much is a carefully constructed mask? Zachary Anderson fooled everyone. He fooled Matt Herle, who considered him a friend. He fooled Kayla Herle, who welcomed him into her home. He fooled an entire community that prided itself on knowing everyone. He played softball and drank beers and talked about hunting cabins, and the whole time he was hiding what he really was. So how do you know? How do you protect your children without teaching them to be afraid of everyone? How do you maintain trust in a world where trust can be so catastrophically betrayed? How do you live in a small town where everyone knows everyone when you've learned that knowing someone doesn't mean you really know them at all? These are the questions Watkins was forced to confront. These are the questions every parent watching this has to grapple with, and these are the questions that don't have easy answers. What happened to Elena Herle wasn't random. It wasn't a stranger abduction. It wasn't bad luck or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a deliberate act by someone who'd been trusted, someone who'd been welcomed, someone who'd been given access to a child because her parents believed he was safe. And that's what makes this case so terrifying, because it means it could happen to anyone. It could happen in any town. It could happen to any family that makes the mistake of trusting the wrong person. The investigation into Anderson's background continued even after he was charged. Investigators wanted to know if there were other victims, other families who needed to know the truth. They interviewed people who'd known him. They looked into his past relationships. They examined every place he'd lived, every job he'd had, every opportunity he might have had to harm a child. And while I can't share specific details about what they found, what I can tell you is this. The pattern of behavior they uncovered suggested that August 20th, 2016 wasn't the first time Zachary Anderson had thought about hurting a child. It was just the first time he'd actually done it, or at least the first time he'd been caught. That distinction matters, because it means there might have been a chance to stop him before Elena. There might have been warning signs that were missed, complaints that weren't taken seriously enough, moments when intervention could have changed everything. But those moments passed, those opportunities were lost, and on August 20th, 2016, Zachary Anderson finally acted on the impulses he'd been hiding for years, and a 5-year-old girl paid the price. The Herle family, in the midst of their grief, had to make impossible decisions. They had to plan a funeral for their daughter. They had to decide what to say, how to say it, how to honor Elena's memory, while grappling with the horror of how she died. They had to be strong for their son, Carter, who'd lost his little sister, his best friend, the girl who always gave the best hugs. And they had to do all of this while knowing that the man who'd killed their daughter was someone they'd trusted, someone they'd invited into their home, someone who'd sat at their table and played with their children and pretended to be their friend. That betrayal, that violation of trust, is almost as devastating as the loss itself, because it means you can't even trust your own judgment anymore. It means every decision you made, every person you welcomed into your life, is now suspect. It means the world isn't just dangerous, it's deceptive. And that's a kind of trauma that never fully heals. St. Anthony Catholic Church began preparing for Elena's funeral. The church that had been the heart of the community through the drunk driving deaths and the tornado and every other crisis Watkins had faced. The church where Elena had been baptized, where she'd attended services with her family, where she was supposed to have her first communion and confirmation, and eventually, decades from now, maybe even her wedding. Instead, they were preparing for her funeral. The community rallied around the Herle family in the way small towns do. Meals were prepared, donations were collected, people offered to help with whatever was needed. But there's only so much casseroles and kind words can do when your 5-year-old daughter has been murdered by someone you trusted. The grief in Watkins was palpable. You could feel it walking down Main Street, see it in the faces of people at the grocery store, hear it in the silence that fell over conversations when Elena's name was mentioned. This wasn't just a tragedy. This was a wound that would scar the entire community forever. And through it all, one question kept echoing. One question that no one could answer, but everyone kept asking. How did we not see it? How did we not know? Zachary Anderson had been among them for years. He'd worked alongside them. He'd played softball with them. He'd drunk beers with them. He'd been one of them. And the entire time, he'd been hiding a monster behind a friendly smile and casual conversation about hunting cabins. If they couldn't see it in him, how could they see it in anyone? That's the question that keeps parents up at night. That's the fear that changes how you look at the world. That's the loss of innocence that extends far beyond the immediate victim. Because Elena wasn't the only one who lost something on August 20th, 2016. An entire community lost its sense of safety, lost its ability to trust, lost the belief that knowing someone means you really know them. And that loss, while not as devastating as the loss of a child's life, is still profound, still permanent, still a kind of death. So here's what I want you to think about as we move into the final part of this story. Justice was coming for Zachary Anderson. The legal system was going to ensure he never walked free again. The Herle family was going to stand in a courtroom and face their daughter's killer and tell him exactly what he'd taken from them. But would any of that bring Elena back? Would any of that restore the trust that had been shattered? Would any of that answer the question of how you're supposed to live in a world where the people you trust can betray you so completely? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what's going through your mind. Because what comes next, the funeral and the trial and the aftermath, is going to test everything you believe about justice and healing and whether it's possible to move forward after something like this. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because this story isn't over. And what happens next will show you both the worst and the best of humanity. But today, your phone is a digital footprint. Your searches are a window into your mind. Your movements are tracked, time-stamped, and recorded. Lies leave trails, and those trails lead straight to the truth. So what's the lesson here? Trust can be weaponized. Zion Foster trusted her cousin. She'd known him her entire life. He was family. He was supposed to be safe. But family bonds don't guarantee safety. Blood doesn't mean protection. Sometimes, the people closest to us are the ones capable of the greatest harm. And in the digital age, no matter how hard someone tries to cover their tracks, no matter how many phones they wipe, how many lies they tell, how many stories they change, the truth has a way of surfacing. Because technology doesn't forget, data doesn't lie, and justice, even when delayed, can still be delivered. Zion Foster should be 20 years old today. She should be in college, chasing her dreams, laughing with friends, making memories with her mom. Instead, her story is a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil doesn't always look like a stranger in a dark alley. Sometimes it looks like someone you've known your whole life, someone you trust, someone you love. And for Ciara Milton, Zion's story is an unending grief. A daughter lost, a body never recovered, a void that can never be filled. But it's also a testament to a mother's love, a mother who refused to give up, who fought for justice, who made sure the world knew Zion's name. Zion Foster's life mattered, and because of her mother's fight and the relentless work of investigators, her killer will never walk free again. A trusted cousin, a vanished teen, a mother's fury. This is the story of Zion Foster, a 17-year-old girl whose life was stolen by someone she loved, someone she called her favorite. It's the story of Jalen Brazier, a man who threw away his cousin's body, lied for years, and tried to erase the evidence. But technology, determination, and a mother's unbreakable will brought him to justice. The verdict brought legal closure, but for Sierra Milton, there will never be true peace, because Zion is still out there, somewhere, and her mother will never get to say goodbye. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more true crime deep dives like this one. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the sentence was fair? And what would you say to Sierra Milton if you could? Thanks for watching Criminal Instinct. Until next time, stay safe out there.